I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Research Fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, and I will be introducing and moderating today's session of the European Security Initiative Speaker Series, where we're going to focus on the transatlantic community and the transatlantic relationship. Now, as Russia has challenged the West over the last 7 to 10 years, the ability of the West to work together, to coordinate on policy and to act in unison has been important and been a key factor in the West's ability to provide an effective response to Russia's challenge. The last 4 years and US relations with Europe have been challenging. While at working levels in the US government, people have tried to maintain a steadiness to the relationship with Europe. At the top, with President Trump, you have somebody whose attitude and his actions have weakened that relationship and have provoked tension between the two sides of the Atlantic. And one result of this is the transatlantic community has been less able to deal effectively with the challenges posed by Russia. Now, President-elect Biden takes office in January, and we will then have a transatlanticist again in the White House. So I'm delighted today to have David McKean and Szewczyk to talk to us about what we can expect from a Biden presidency and how it will approach the transatlantic relationship. David and Bart are authors of the book, Partners of First Resort, America, Europe, and the Future of the West. David is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. He's had long experience on Capitol Hill. From 2013 until 2016, he was the director of the State Department's policy planning staff. And from 2016 to 2017, he was the American ambassador to Luxembourg. Bart is an adjunct professor at the Sciences Po School of International Affairs in Paris. He served on the State Department's policy planning staff from 2014 until 2017. And then from 2016 to 2017, he concurrently served as a senior policy advisor to Samantha Powers, the American ambassador to the United Nations. They're going to talk about their expectations and what we should expect for a Biden presidency and the kind of policy it will mean for the transatlantic community, and in particular, how that means how that community will be able to deal with Russia. After their opening comments, we'll take questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. David, Bart, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve. I'll start it off, and we're both delighted to be with you, Bart in Brussels, and I'm in Washington, D.C. What I thought I'd do is start off by giving you really both Bart and I will give you sort of a thumbnail sketch of our book. Our fundamental argument is that the transatlantic relationship is key to the strengthening and restoration of the liberal international order, rules-based order, whatever you choose to call it. And as you said, Steve, we believe it's been fraying for years, but in many ways it was shattered during the Trump administration. And I don't know if any of you saw an op-ed that David Ignatius wrote in the Washington Post last week, where he quoted Henry Kissinger on the issue of what it will take to reestablish the liberal international order. But he pointed to two very important issues. Number one, he said, a common purpose on big issues, even as rivalries continue. And number two, mutual security for all powers. So as we continue this discussion, I hope you'll keep those concepts in mind, common purpose and mutual security, because we believe they are the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship. And I'll come back to them in a minute, but what I'd like to do first is just give you, again, a very brief sort of outline of how we structure our book. The first half of our book is we provide a history of the transatlantic relationship, and it's some of this is pretty well-trodden territory. Many of you will be familiar with it, but we believe that in order to understand where we are now and where we might be going, we've got to understand where we've been. And I think I don't want to overdraw the comparison, but there are some pretty interesting comparisons between today and the 1930s and early 1940s. There was, of course, in the 1930s, a global depression, economic depression that in the United States had a somewhat ineffectual president who chose, in large part, to blame the global depression on European powers. The mood of the country was very isolationist. There was a strong America First movement. And there was at heart a struggle between authoritarianism, albeit cloaked in fascism, and democracy. And one of the important events in early or mid 1940 that we talk about in our book is the Atlantic Charter. And as you may recall, this came about when President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill secretly met off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941. And the meeting, from Churchill's point of view, was critical to gaining American military support. But Roosevelt was already actually thinking beyond the war. The League of Nations Treaty of Versailles had failed miserably, and FDR wanted a new approach to international relations, a new world order. And he understood that Britain, though weakened and nearly bankrupt, still had an empire, and so that their acquiescence to certain principles and their participation would be very, very important. And FDR and Churchill issued the Atlantic Charter, which was, in essence, it was a statement it was a vision, it was a statement of certain principles. It included disarmament of aggressor nations, self-determination for people around the world, and that was an obvious concession on the part of Churchill, who was an avowed imperialist. It included respect for the sovereignty of nations, and there was obviously a strong humanitarian component on the part of Roosevelt, who wanted, it echoed his four freedom speech: freedom from poverty, freedom from hunger. So this institutional framework that Churchill and Roosevelt laid out, it ultimately couldn't have been possible without, obviously, the participation of Britain. But it in the end, it formed the Transatlantic Alliance, and it gave birth to a number of the institutions that we now know that undergird that, the liberal international order. And I'm referring to the UN, created in 1945, later the World Bank and IMF, NATO, which came about in 1949. And that's the foundation, obviously, of the mutual security that Kissinger talks about. Treaty of Rome in 1957, which then gave way to the European Union in the early 90s. And so in our book, Bart and I, we call for a restatement of and an updating of the Atlantic Charter. It's something that President H.W. Bush called for before he left office. It's also something that Kissinger has referred to as well. But I think it's important that that there be a vision for the Transatlantic Alliance, a new vision in the 21st century. And one of the things that I think Bart and I learned in policy planning is that in order to fulfill a vision, you first need to understand what the challenges are, what the impediments are, and then you need to craft a strategy. So I think, but before we get to that, I think I want to let Bart continue this a little bit and perhaps give us a bit of history on the transatlantic relations from the Cold War to the end of the George W. Bush administration in 2008.
Great, thanks so much, David. And let me echo David's thanks to both Ambassador Pfeiffer as well as to Ambassador McFall, who helped organize this event. And Stanford is really truly privileged to have both of them at the helm at Stanford, because there are really very few individuals, as Steve and Mike, who know Russia and Ukraine as well as they do, as well as wider transatlantic relations, especially in that part of the world. As David mentioned, when we get to the Cold War, the transatlantic relationship really settled into a relatively stable equilibrium with the US as the predominant security guarantor. And that sort of maintained stability throughout the Cold War, even as there were ups and downs in the relationship. You had the Suez Crisis in 1956, Charles de Gaulle's withdrawal from NATO's military structures in 1966. And even though European partners supported the United States during the Korean War, there actually were no European countries that supported US efforts in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s, setting aside how that war is viewed, there were no European partners that supported US efforts. And so people sometimes mythologize the simplicity in transatlantic unity during the Cold War, but really the golden age of the West and of the liberal order occurred in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, when it seemed that the Western standard for global success was the only one around. And throughout the 1990s, you saw this in reality. You had NATO and EU enlargement across Central and Eastern Europe. You had the notion embedded in national security strategies of the US government that all major powers, including Russia and China, would become liberal democracies. And generally, this entrenchment of what it meant to be successful in the world. You had to have democracy, human rights, rule of law, free trade, market capitalism. And in the 2000s, fast forwarding a little bit, obviously 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated US foreign policy thinking, but they didn't really change fundamentally the strategic trajectory and narrative of the liberal model. And then came the financial crisis of 2008, which both marked the end of this golden age, as it were, and really undercut the overall strategic narrative, because all of a sudden you had an internal weakening within the West, and the strategic narrative no longer seemed to be as strong as it was before. And so in our view, the modern story of the West is really a struggle between these two images: the hopes of 1989 and the fears of 2008, a year that was remembered for internal challenges and external threats from liberal actors. And in many ways, before we get to the Obama administration, which David will continue on now, the West had really become a victim of its own success. Its model had widespread appeal across the globe, but on the other hand, it seemed to be a little bit too aspirational and too, perhaps a little bit too broad to be fully effective. And it turned out that countries like Russia and China weren't necessarily going to follow the Western model after all. But let me turn back to David, who will give you an intro on our view of the Obama years when we served there in the US government, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Bart. I think we both believe that the record showed that President Obama valued the transatlantic relationship, although it was not really his top priority. He clearly hoped to initiate the pivot to Asia. And we write in our book that the relationship was important but not urgent, essential to everything but prioritizing nothing, with a deep history but an ambivalent future. And in the end, of course, President Obama was deeply frustrated in foreign policy as his administration became mired in the politics and the wars of the Middle East. But he did have some foreign policy successes working with our European allies, and the obvious examples are the JCPOA and the Paris Climate Agreement. But they were not agreements that were simply US Eurocentric. They were global agreements. We couldn't have achieved them without the help and participation of our allies. But in the end, they were global agreements. And in Obama's second term, again, these are during the years that I think that particularly he was preoccupied with the Middle East. But there was also a second challenge that was very important, that was at the heart of Europe. And Bart's going to talk about that, I think, for a minute, I'm hoping, and that is Ukraine.
Sounds great. And so, as David mentioned, while President Obama sought to build a more equitable partnership with Europe, and there were numerous transatlantic summits and meetings in the first 3 years, the main action, diplomatic action and otherwise, occurred elsewhere. You had the reset with Russia during the first 2 years, the pivot to Asia, and an overall new engagement with the world through the G7 summits and other formats. And in some ways, the most tangible form of transatlantic cooperation during the first Obama term, which was NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, proved to be a short-lived success and a long-term cautionary lesson. The second term became a lot more complicated with the Syrian civil war ongoing. And by 2014, and this is probably of particular interest to this audience, you had the conflict in Ukraine, as well as ISIS attacks throughout Europe, and a series of crises in Europe that really brought to the fore the priority of Europe as a region for the US government to focus on. Let me spend a couple of minutes on Ukraine. This is probably familiar territory to a lot of people in the audience, but the US government throughout the second term of the Obama administration was very actively engaged on Ukraine, especially, if you talk about Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State John Kerry, and a host of other officials. President Obama, for his part, I think viewed Ukraine in more limited terms in terms of what was at stake for the United States and US national interest. He viewed Ukraine sort of like he viewed a number of other issues as more challenges for the wider world, wider collective action, because of principles of territorial integrity and state sovereignty at stake. And he very much encouraged European leadership to be at the forefront on this issue. And for the US, he probably viewed the US national interest in what was happening in Ukraine as the same as that of many other countries. And so he wanted to galvanize collective action on behalf of Ukraine by way of transatlantic sanctions against Russia, to put pressure on Russia to change its behavior in Ukraine, economic and political support for reform in Ukraine. And you had a number of policies that pretty quickly became embedded between the US and the EU, so much so that by the time we get to the last 4 years, which probably have been the most challenging for the transatlantic relationship, those lines of effort actually were able to persist, notwithstanding potentially, different preferences from the top. Let me kick it back over to David to maybe spend a few minutes on the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and then we'll give you our take on where we think we should go from here, and specifically some of our proposals that we have in the book.
So much has happened in the last 4 years that sometimes it's difficult to remember just how stunned the world was when Donald Trump won the presidency. He was, as you may recall, he was a candidate with absolutely no prior public service, no real concept of international relations. And honestly, the extent of his overseas travel was that he had invested in golf courses. Yet he defeated 11 opponents in the Republican primaries, and in the end beat Hillary Clinton, who was a former senator, former Secretary of State, and someone who President Obama called the most qualified candidate to ever run for president. His inaugural address, again, is something that we looked back at, and it was also very, very surprising because, notwithstanding that the United States had emerged from the 2008 economic crisis, it really in pretty good shape relative to the rest of the world, and was doing very well. We were a nation of great material wealth, and we had then enormous geopolitical standing. The president described the period as though we were his words were, we were undergoing a period of carnage, and it required placing America first. And in short, what he was saying was that the alliances would be replaced by a zero-sum approach to international relations. So it was no surprise, really, that in contrast to President Obama, President Trump actually proved very hostile to the transatlantic relationship. And I'm not going to go through all of the insults and that President Trump heaped on the transatlantic alliance, but I will just remind you of a few. He knew nothing of Europe's history. He insulted European leaders. He called Brussels a hellhole. He threatened to withdraw from NATO, and he appointed a hotel executive to be his ambassador to the EU, who subsequently said that his objective was to destroy the European Union. And both Bart and I interviewed a number of former officials, both in Europe and in the United States. And I think the the most positive thing we heard about the Trump administration vis-a-vis Europe was that he didn't really have a policy towards Europe, didn't really have a policy, a foreign policy. And that in the end, most European leaders ignored him. And I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but as I say, I think it was in some ways the most positive thing we heard about President Trump. In many quarters, the Trump presidency has been perceived as a transformation of U.S. policy and of our alliances. And yet, in our book, what we argue is that it's actually an aberration, not a pivot point. And when I say aberration, I'm really talking about an aberration in the last 70 years, because in some respects, honestly, Trump's foreign policy harkens back to 18th century America, when our national leaders showed great skepticism towards alliances. And so the question that Bart and I ask is, how can a Biden administration repair the damage, and what do we need to do? What does a Biden administration need to do? And again, I think, as you remember in the very beginning, I said one of the things that you need to think about before you lay out a strategy is, what are the internal and external challenges that we face? And I think the United States has a number of internal challenges, and this is not, again, something that started with President Trump, although I think he exacerbated the situation. And it's something that Richard Haas talks about frequently, that if we are that city on the hill, we need to represent values that can be applied universally. And yet we are a very divided nation. We continue to have very serious divisions along ethnic and racial lines. In terms of foreign policy, most people think we spend too much money on foreign aid, and that it's a waste of money. They don't understand the value of alliances. And so there are a lot of issues here that will make it difficult for a Biden administration to make, I think, significant progress in terms of repairing the alliances quickly. But Bart, I think you're going to talk a little bit about some of the external challenges, including the ongoing issues with Russia and also the rise of China.
That's right. And, David discussed some of the internal challenges to the liberal order, to the strength of the West. And those are not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And both sides also face similar external challenges, primarily from Russia and China, who are sometimes grouped together, but they actually pose different categories of challenge. And maybe let me spend a little bit of time on that, and then we could get into the specific details in the Q&A. Russia is a very large country, but it's a very small economy, akin to South Korea or Australia, and so not a major economic power in the world. It has a significant military, but that the scope of the military is also somewhat constrained by the limited scope of its economy. Its diplomatic efforts and institutional initiatives have largely stagnated its foremost political project, the Eurasian Economic Union, doesn't really do much beyond, superficial meetings and so forth. And its primary sort of activity in the world is not as a constructive stakeholder, but really as a spoiler. It frequently uses its veto power in the Security Council to block action, and it can use its military and intelligence instruments to thwart US or European objectives, but really can't shape, the global order and its image in any particular way. And you can see that by just the few friends that it has around the world. China is a little bit different. China, primarily because of its economic scale and its continuing growth, extraordinary growth, even during the pandemic, really poses a transformational challenge to the West and to the liberal order. And, to be honest with each other, its institutional initiatives and diplomatic efforts actually sometimes bear fruit. You had the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015, when a lot of European countries joined the board, and as well as other countries around the world. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a set of infrastructure projects that the Chinese government can offer on very competitive financial terms to other partners around the world. And those are compelling offers that a lot of countries will buy into in the short term, even if they have longer term, potentially negative consequences. And so I think some of this, some of the public debate and the understanding across the Atlantic has sort of caught up with our book. But we really, saw a need as we started working on this 2 years ago, that you really couldn't deal with the challenge of China without strong transatlantic action. And how do we get there? What's missing right now in our current structure that does not provide for effective transatlantic coordination on these issues and other issues? What we argue is that, at the very least now, with the incoming Biden administration, which could be the most transatlanticist in decades, there's a hope at the very least, perhaps even a probability or likelihood of reinvigorating the transatlantic alliance. And we propose 2 steps to help in that effort, although we have a fallback option if those turn out not to be feasible for whatever reason. But what we argue for is, again, a new Atlantic Charter, and that's why we began this long journey with the Atlantic Charter of Roosevelt and Churchill from 1941. And so we call for a new transatlantic strategic partnership agreement that will be either a renewal of commitments, obligations, responsibilities by the 2 sides, and updated for the challenges of our time. And we also call for the creation of a Transatlantic Council that would help coordinate joint action and analysis on a range of issues. And let me turn it back to David to address some of these issues, and then I'll pick up as well at the end.
So, I think the danger is that this may sound like we're just adding another bureaucratic layer here. But the truth is, you have to have institutional structures in place in order to actually make things happen. And so that, we believe that there need to be much more structured dialogues on regions of common interest, whether it's Asia, Africa, or Latin America, where transatlantic coordination, which has been, and we can sort of tell you from firsthand experience, somewhat sporadic, usually at the highest levels, and too often without the sort of requisite staff prep work in advance. And so, for example, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs should really be meeting with their European counterparts in order to understand what it is, how Europe is approaching that region of the world? And are there joint strategies that we can pursue relative to the rise of China? Or are there other issues of mutual interest that we can pursue together? And we also have suggested that perhaps transatlantic summits could be layered on top of NATO summits. And the first day would focus on sort of NATO's core mission of collective defense, and then the second day would focus on a wider discussion of foreign policy challenges. And again, that way, it's a more cohesive summit, a more cohesive meeting, and less of, frankly, of a photo op. So, Bart, maybe you can talk a little bit more about, or just maybe give a conclusion to that, because I think we're running out of time here, and I know Steve wants to get to some questions.
Sounds great. Well, look, I mean, we're pretty clear-eyed on this, and we have no illusions that any of this is easy, but we think it's advisable. But even if we don't get, transatlantic strategic partnership agreement or the council, we think that, as important will be restoring the psychological commitment and ethos that characterize the Old West, and the instinctive muscle memory of relying on each other as partners of first, even if not only, resort. And we believe that sort of instinct has atrophied really over the past 4 years, and maybe stagnated beforehand as well. And so if I could paraphrase Churchill a little bit, we could say that the struggle for the soul of the nation has been won. And now the struggle for the soul of the West is about to begin. And, really there are competing visions, whether America and Europe can recover instincts for joint action or are doomed to pursue divergent paths. And maybe I'll just close with a quote from President-elect Biden from 7 years ago at the Munich Security Conference. And he said, Europe is the cornerstone of our engagement with the world, and Europe is our catalyst for global cooperation. It remains America's indispensable partner of first resort. And then he continued, if you could forgive me some presumptuousness, I believe America remains your indispensable partner. Now, luckily, it just so happened that a week ago, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, in his address to the European Parliament also stated, quote, all in all, the EU and the United States are and will remain key strategic partners of first resort in critically difficult moments, like the ones that we are living. And then he continued in a blog, for the EU, the US is our most important ally and partner, and we believe the same is true in reverse. But this stuff is not going to happen automatically, and there are competing visions in terms of whether on the US side, Europe should have this privileged priority position, and then on the European side, whether even if the Biden administration is the most transatlanticist in decades, what will come next? And so just these past few days, it's been fascinating to see a debate between French President Emmanuel Macron and the German defense minister. And they have, clearly outlined competing visions of what transatlantic relations should look like. So we, hope and have titled our book as Partners of First Resort. We like that instinct to prevail for the West. And again, partners of first resort does not mean that other partners like Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea are not going to be integral to global collective action. They will be, but we think that we need to restore the core engine of global action, and that's the West. That's a strong Europe with a strong America working together. And let's turn it back to you, Stephen, to moderate the Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that terrific description of how we've got here and what we should be doing. Let me pose one question before drawing questions from the Q&A section, and that is, I think there will be a readiness on the part of Europe for a better relationship. I think most Europeans see these last 4 years as being very difficult. But some of the things that you've sketched out, a new transatlantic charter, shaping new strategic council, that's going to take time. But let's say it's January 21st. We now have not President-elect, but President Biden. What would be the 2 or 3 things that you would see that the Biden administration could do very quickly to basically signal that, yes, there is a reality here that means going back towards a more productive, a more cooperative relationship between the United States and Europe?
Well, I mean, clearly getting right back, I mean, we list 5 areas at the end of our book that we think there is a fertile ground for cooperation and for progress. And those are in the areas of climate, public health, cyber, trade, and technology. And clearly in climate, we are now, as of 1 week, out of the Paris Accord. But on January 21st, we can get back into it, and we should very, very quickly. And secondly, I think public health, i.e. the pandemic, is obviously a global phenomenon. Again, some of the things that President Trump said about Europe have been accurate, but the way he approached this was so antagonistic, and we can get back into a situation where we are working with our European allies. So many of the potential vaccines are in this country, but they're also in Europe. And we should be working much more closely together on making sure that those vaccines are produced safely and that they're distributed fairly. And so I think those are 2 areas that immediately we can begin to work with our European allies.
And I would just say, some of these things don't have to take too long. There are draft texts that one could put together relatively quickly for a transatlantic strategic partnership agreement. And the Transatlantic Council that we have in mind is, a relatively flexible institution akin to a G7 or G20, without its own sort of building or permanent secretariat. Is just a way of arranging meetings and structuring the internal decision-making within the U.S. government as well as on the EU side. We should flag that what we mean by the Transatlantic Council is, all NATO and all EU member states together, along with the NATO Secretary General and the European Council President and the European Commission President. Normally, you have just small subgroups of these wider bodies get together. And here we really think that a large tent approach is sensible. And really for the incoming Biden team, controlling and dealing with the pandemic will be issue number 1, 2, and 3. And issue number 4, 5, and 6 will be to deal with the economic aftermath that we're going through because of the pandemic. And on both issues, as David rightly pointed out, you're going to need to cooperate with Europe very closely, as well as other partners. But we think that our idea for global action is generating a core consensus within the transatlantic partnership, and then branching out with other partners.
Okay, let me turn to questions now. Okay, this question is, post-Cold War, wasn't the Eastern movement of NATO a particularly important factor in the development of relations between the transatlantic community and Russia? And after that, there's also the European Union. You had this institutional move towards the East. How do you see that having affected those relationships, but also the potential, what will be the impact on the future? How big of a factor will this be in the ability of the transatlantic community to define, hopefully, a better relationship with Russia?
Bart, do you want to?
Yeah, I can start with a couple of thoughts. Look, I think on the side of the West, especially in Europe, but also in parts of the United States, there is a lot of sort of revisionist self-flagellation over things that we did with NATO enlargement or EU enlargement and how that affected Russia's self-image or self-worth and posture in the world. But the reality is that both NATO enlargement and EU enlargement throughout the 90s and the 2000s was not directed against Russia, really didn't affect much Russia one way or the other. It was really about the countries involved and the right of those countries in Central and Eastern Europe to choose their own alliances, their own institutional memberships. And if you look at the record, Russia was actually considered as a potential candidate country for NATO membership. Now, NATO with Russia would look quite differently than NATO right now. But there was a serious conversation in the 1990s, and even during the George W. Bush administration of potentially inviting Russia as a on a long-term basis as a member of NATO. It wouldn't necessarily have the same Article 5 guarantees, and it wouldn't be able to block collective decision-making on Article 5. It would be a reimagined NATO in the larger tent context. But there was a lot of effort on the part of both the United States and European countries to reach out to Russia and to assuage any concerns that Russia might have. And the trigger point for the Ukraine conflict in late 2013 and early 2014 and over the past 6 years had nothing to do with NATO. The last NATO enlargement was that affected Russia was back in 2004 when Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia entered NATO. It was over EU accession, not even EU accession negotiations, but an association agreement between Ukraine and the EU to provide for greater trade between the two and so forth. And for Russia, it was really about the economics of the deal. It was about the political trajectory that that deal reflected and the potential of having, a proper, democratic, confident, united Ukraine that was increasingly integrating with the West, as well as, continuing to do business with Russia. That deal somehow was, anathema to the Kremlin, and they forced Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president, to basically at the 11th hour pull out of the negotiations with the EU. That then led to protests at the Maidan in late 2013 and early 2014, and everyone knows the story that followed. But again, it had nothing to do with NATO. NATO enlargement wasn't on the books. EU enlargement wasn't on the table for Ukraine at that point either. It was just this relatively, limited association agreement, and that proved to be too much for Russia. So I think at this point, I'm pretty pessimistic on the future of Western-Russian relations, because we've tried so many different things in terms of outreach to Russia without success. And over the past 6 years, we've tried a number of pressure points against Russia to change its behavior in Ukraine, but again, also with limited success. Maybe we were able to deter it from going much further, but clearly they're still in Eastern Ukraine. Clearly they still occupy Crimea. And so I think really the Western-Russian relations aren't really that much about us. They're mostly about the Kremlin.
Okay.
The only thing I'd add to that is just that, I think that, and it has less to do with Russia than it just the EU itself. I mean, EU enlargement has made the EU understandably more unwieldy. And so that you now have, countries like Poland and Hungary and even Italy that are proving to be difficult partners for the EU, and that will ultimately make the EU-US relationship somewhat more fraught as well. So while I think in the sort of larger scheme of things, enlargement was a very, very positive development, it's also created certain challenges moving ahead.
Okay. Well, let me now try to combine two questions. One goes back to the point about Macron versus AKK. Do you think that strategic autonomy is fundamentally compatible with transatlanticism? And I would combine that with the second question, which is that given what Europe saw that happened with the Trump phenomenon, will Europe be able to have trust that the United States can in fact return to and then remain a long-term partner?
Well, let me take the first question, or the second part of that question first. Look, I think most Europeans view Trump as an aberration as well. And the relationship, as Bart, I think, described during the 1950s, and again with George W. Bush, we certainly had ups and downs. We had controversies, whether it was over nuclear deployment of missiles or Vietnam War or Iraq. But in the end, we do share sort of a common set of values and I think a belief in a rules-based order. And Trump really flew in the face of that. And so I think that it will be possible to once again gain the trust of European leaders. And I actually don't think it's going to. I think what Bart said, that that we may, with President Biden, may have the sort of the most significant Atlanticists in years taking the helm. So I'm actually optimistic about that part of it.
That's right. And on the first part of the question, look, it's an ongoing debate in Europe, and one thing I would say is the concept of strategic autonomy, at least at the EU level, actually dates back to the 2016 EU global strategy, which we saw when David and I were at the State Department, and we had input into, we consulted with the drafters of that strategy, not only us, but the EU officials went on the road to other partners around the world. And the term appropriate level of strategic autonomy for the EU or something like this is in the EU's global strategy from 2016. And we saw no problem with that because everyone was focused like a laser on the common challenges of the Ukraine conflict, terrorist attacks in Europe and the United States, the ongoing civil war in Syria, ongoing difficulties throughout the Middle East and North Africa, as well as the global refugee crisis. And so we really were joined at the hip in addressing all these common challenges and figuring out, practically speaking, who would do what and in what order, and to assess, what progress we were making. And we weren't really spending so much time on larger kind of theological debates. My worry is that now, given all the turmoil over the past 4 years, and really a focus on this debate in Europe, that the debate around U.S.-European relations will be framed around this question, which I don't think is the core question, rather than our common challenges, which I think is what we should be focused on. And on the, if you focus on the common challenges, the set of answers, or at least the set of options that you should take into account, seem relatively obvious to us. If you focus on the first, set of issues, strategic autonomy versus trans-Atlanticism and so forth, then I could see how, it could become a somewhat acrimonious and sort of debate filled with friction, rather than figuring out, okay, we have a bunch of problems on our plate. How do we practically deal with them? And so I hope that, there's a lot of various statements, both on the in the US and in Europe. And so it's difficult sometimes to separate the wheat from the chaff. But I think once all that settles down, I would hope that people will return to this notion that both Europe and America are each other's partners of first resort. That's the core message. and they have a number of common challenges that they can only deal with jointly in trying to resolve, and not only by working together, but also working with other international partners. And so that's really the core message of our book, and I hope that's where the direction of the debate will go into.
And if I could just add one quick thing, I mean, I think it's obviously going to depend on issue by issue, because if you go back to the Obama administration, TTIP was something that in the end could have been a win-win for both sides in terms of a trade deal, and it really didn't in the end get very far. The Europeans were frankly worried about their economic autonomy, and the United States perhaps was asking for things that in the end were never going to happen in terms of a trade deal. But it's an example of where we failed, but we in our book talk about that we believe it's something that we should take up again, and because it is so clearly in the interests of both the United States and our European allies.
Okay. As the Biden administration shapes its policy approach towards Europe, could you talk a little bit about the balance of effort between the State Department and the Defense Department? Should there be some rebalancing in the roles of those two entities as we get back to a more normal transatlantic relationship?
Well, I'll just, Bart, chime in at any point on this. Before I was the director of policy planning, I ran something called the QDDR in the State Department for a year, and it gave me a bird's eye view on the department and on how the State Department had ceded a lot of not only power but responsibility to the Department of Defense, and it's I think in many ways a significant problem. So it's not just relative to Europe. This is something that the State Department has to, I think, figure out moving forward globally. And I would hope that that President Biden, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, not the Armed Services Committee, understands this, and I'm sure he does. So I have no way of knowing whether this is something that they'll move on in the next year or so, but I think it's of critical importance.
I would just add that this is sort of a perennial problem that goes back to actually David's predecessor on the policy planning staff, George Kennan, the first director of policy planning, as well as I saw in the participants list, Steve Krasner is also on the call, and and he was a great director of policy planning as well. But Kennan worried about the War Department having too much power during the World War II effort, and what that would mean for U.S. foreign policy going forward. And so he suggests a number of things that the State Department and his policy planning staff in particular should do. Right now, obviously, just the balance of resources between the two institutions is so lopsided that any sensible rearrangement would allocate greater resources to the State Department. And you've seen a number of senior Defense Department officials call for this. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done. And notwithstanding a lot of good faith effort, rebalancing those resources might take some time. But I think, it's quite amazing what U.S. diplomacy can accomplish, even with somewhat relatively more limited resources than the Pentagon. And I think the world is hungry for a restoration and kind of reinvigorated U.S. diplomatic effort. Europe is hungry for it, and I think it will be a very interesting several years to be sure.
Okay, the next question. You described how President Obama, favored a good transatlantic relationship, but did not really see it as a priority. And did that maybe describe as, say, a hesitant engagement with the transatlantic order and with the international order? did that perhaps make it easier then for President Trump to come in, and then move further down that slippery slope towards disengagement and the kind of antagonism we've seen between the United States and major European countries?
President Trump is such a unique individual. I'm not sure that it made it easier. I mean, I think what we said was that the transatlantic relationship had been fraying for many years, and so that even this is prior to the engagement or lackadaisical engagement of President Obama. And I think again, it was, the trajectory was not a good one, and President Trump was just extraordinary in how he ruptured the relationships.
Okay.
I would just add that, President Obama's intuition was that, and you heard it in the corridors of US government, that, Europe basically was a stable part of the world, an equal partner to the United States, that did not demand a high priority of attention. And the approach was to treat European counterparts as equal partners, as they were, as a way of focusing on wider global action. And I think that was the intuition, and it was manifested with the G20 summits, the reset with Russia, and the pivot to Asia, which was conceptualized as an effort with Europe to pivot greater attention to Asia. And of course, then in the second term of the Obama-Biden administration, there were a number of crises in Ukraine, ISIS, the refugee crisis, that brought back to the fore US-European relations in particular. But the intuition that President Obama had wasn't because he didn't care about Europe. He very much emphasized throughout all of his speeches the importance of Europe as a catalyst for global action. But I guess in some ways, perhaps we didn't appreciate sufficiently the ongoing challenges that remained in parts of Europe that came to the fore in the second term.
Well, let me pose one last question, which is, could you talk a little bit more in detail about how a Biden administration might work to enhance transatlantic cooperation to deal with the rising China? And in particular, the Trump administration has moved towards this construct of the Indo-Pacific concept. Is that something that the Europeans and the institutions like the European Union will buy into? Because that's a little bit broader than China. That's a wider geographic scope.
Bart, I'll let you start on that one.
Sounds good. Well, look, I think the Trump administration sort of stumbled at the 11th hour into the notion that he needed allies and partners to cooperate with to deal with a complex challenge such as China. And in fact, I think about a month ago or so, there was a lot of buzz around this new US-EU dialogue on China that was announced after a call between Secretary of State Pompeo and the HRVP Borrell. And this is exactly what should have been done at the beginning of the administration, what we discussed in our book as we were drafting it 2 years ago. And it's difficult to do at the 11th hour as you're sort of leaving office. But I think what the Biden administration is likely to do, and it's obviously impossible for us to know and predict, but my sense is that there will be a lot more disciplined in terms of laying out and sketching out all the different policy areas where the US needs to develop joint action with European and other partners as a way of dealing with China's challenge. And part of it is on regulating 5G and other technology issues. Part of it is figuring out, how to regulate foreign investment in other areas, sensitive sectors where you might not want to necessarily have it under Chinese control. And you see that already in Europe. Part of it might be even on an issue like, for instance, Chinese peacekeeping troops deployed as part of UN missions, whether they are there to serve the global public good of maintaining peace and stability in war-torn countries, or is it to develop military training for its own military? And so I think, my guess is there will be a very complex mapping of all the different issue areas, and then a sensible, constructive conversation with European partners and other partners to try to figure out how to deal with these challenges on a long-term basis, because this is not going to be resolved over the next year or, even a two-term Biden administration if that were to occur. But it will really be a long-term challenge, a generational challenge. And for that, you really need both a level of discipline that I think the Biden team will have, as well as this intuition to work with other partners.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time here. David, Bart, let me thank you very much for joining us today for a really interesting conversation. I very much do hope that, in fact, the Biden presidency leads to a restoration of the transatlantic relationship that I knew during my time at the State Department in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So thank you very much for joining us. For our audience, next week we will be on again, although at our regular time of 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we'll have Angela Stent here to talk about what a Biden presidency will mean for U.S. policy towards Russia. So David, Bart, thanks very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, take care now.
All right, bye-bye.